We invite those of you who have questions to use the microphones in the aisles, and we'll just go back and forth from one mic to the next.
Professor Chomsky, a few days ago, our president at a news conference announced a new program to help provide food to the children of Afghanistan. Even Peter Jennings of ABC News sort of hinted that that was a touch of propaganda spurred on by bipartisan complaints that bin Laden was winning the propaganda war worldwide. Are you aware of any organizations that we would do best funneling money that we would like to donate to help increase the food supply in that country?
Oh, yeah, plenty. I mean, this is obviously just, couldn't even pass ABC News. Actually, extremely poor timing. You may have noticed that Bush went to the Red Cross office with a, box or something with, I don't know, $90,000 bills from the children of America to give to the Red Cross, and he arrived just at the time of the news that bombers had destroyed a Red Cross compound that was storing food in Afghanistan. Not the greatest timing, but yeah, that's a joke. But there are plenty of organizations. I mean, the World Food Program, Oxfam, Christian Aid, Save the Children. There are lots of bona fide organizations. I mean, Oxfam's right here in Boston. You don't have to go very far. And they do very serious, honest work. They can't do it now because the way to get food in is to truck it in. Dropping food by air is almost meaningless. Every aid organization has pointed this out. The World Food Program, which is the main one and the most serious one, they've pointed out, I don't think it's been reported here, but it's all over the British press or Financial Times and others, that if you want, they said they might consider airdrops, but if you do, you have to prepare it. You have to prepare an area so that, and it has to be a safe area. You don't want to draw people to places where there's mines all over the place or something like that. So you prepare a safe area. You have people there who are going to pick up the food and distribute it to the people who need it, to the sick, to children, to women, the people who aren't going to get it if you drop food all over. You have to have people there who will give it to the people who need it. It has to be organized. There has to be information saying it's safe to come here. The worst way to do it, which probably causes more harm than good, is just to drop packages around. Who knows what the effects are, even if anyone gets it. But trucking is the right way, is way beyond, and that has been pretty much either stopped or cut back because of the threat of bombing. That's why the UN and the aid agencies are pleading with the United States to stop the bombing while there's still some people alive there. And yes, there are organizations right here in Boston and elsewhere which you certainly can give to, and should. This is a major catastrophe.
Professor Chomsky, thank you for coming tonight, and I know we're all honored to have you here. I wanted to go back to something you said at the beginning of your speech. You mentioned this silent genocide that you blame America for, or will blame America in the coming weeks. I know that you don't believe that America put these Afghan people on the brink of starvation in the first place. You may ascribe that to the world economy. There are many reasons why these people were on the brink of starvation in the first place. So certainly you don't blame America for putting them in the position. Second of all, I thought it was conspicuously absent from your discussion any mention of blaming the Taliban, which could end this genocide that you mentioned by simply turning over Osama bin Laden to an international court. They could end it immediately, and that was conspicuously absent from your discussion. Also, you also mentioned, by analogy, you said that if there were a madman who were down the street, it would be wrong for us to turn assault rifles on our neighbors and to shoot everyone without knowing where he is. I suggest that your analogy is perhaps flawed, and I'd like to pose another one if you'd humor me. Instead of a madman, a killer, being down the street, who knows where, we know exactly where he is. Let's say he's taken over a large mansion. We don't know which room he's in, but the family that lives there has said that they will take up arms and oppose law enforcement from entering the home to obtain this known criminal. Now, how would the government react to a home in this situation? They might cut the power, they might cut the gas, they would probably cut the water. Perhaps they would threaten that if these persons were to aid and abet the criminals and prevent law enforcement from entering the home to take them into incarceration, perhaps, in fact, violent means would be threatened against these people. How do you respond to this hypothetical? And also, My own hypothetical, it's dealing with a house. It's not a country, it's not a sovereign nation. All hypotheticals and analogies are flawed in this way. And so we're dealing here with a serious problem. 6,000 people are dead. If we turn to economic retaliation, if we turn to economic sanctions, certainly the poor Afghan people will be hurt first and foremost by economic sanctions. So I know you're opposed to that. You're obviously opposed to military sanctions. So having ruled out economic and military sanctions, I don't suppose spitballs would be in order.
Well, I already gave you the answer to what I think we ought to do, but let's go through your questions. First of all, you said I blame America, and that is false. I blame you, and I blame me, and I blame the rest of us who are allowing this to happen right in front of our eyes. That's not blaming America. Secondly, when you say that the United States had nothing, that it's the world economy that had to do with Afghanistan, that's just not true. Afghanistan has always been in a very poor place, and there are many reasons for its current straits, but two primary ones are called Russia and the United States. Russia and the United States in the 1980s practically destroyed the place, not to help the Afghans. As soon as the place was destroyed, they pulled out, and the forces that the United States had organized to harass the Russians then took over. They're now called the Northern Alliance, and that led in the early 90s to what Human Rights Watch calls the worst period in Afghan history, as these various criminal forces that the U.S. had organized with its allies just tore the place apart. They probably killed 50,000 people. I mean, they were carrying out mass rapes and slaughters and destroyed Kabul. In fact, they were so horrendous that when the Taliban came in the 1994, 1995, they were actually welcome, because at least they were bringing some kind of order to the place and driving out these madmen who had been left behind from the U.S. war. Meanwhile, the U.S. didn't do anything for them. So when you say, first of all, it's not blame America, it's blaming people like you and me who can do something about it. There's no abstract entity, America, that acts. And we had a lot to do with this, quite a lot to do with it. There are plenty of other forces, too. You say the Taliban could solve the problem by just handing them over to the Taliban could solve a lot of problems by disappearing. I'm sure, I've been strongly in favor of that for a long time. However, I have no way of making them disappear. See, like, suppose we were in Russia in the 1980s, somebody could have, some dissident was criticizing the Russian invasion. Well, a commissar could have stood up and said, look, why are you criticizing the Russian invasion? Why aren't you criticizing what the Afghans are doing to each other? That's the standard commissar line. We know what to think about it. You and I are responsible for what you and I can do and what we do. We have no moral responsibility for what other people do that we can't affect. We may hate it, but we can't do anything about it. Like, we could have a discussion right now about the crimes of Genghis Khan, and we might be correct about it. It would have no moral value whatsoever. It might have some historical value. Same with the crimes that are going on in Sri Lanka, Can't think of anything to do about them? Fine, then have an academic seminar, but don't think it has any moral value. When you tell me what the Taliban can do, it's exactly the same. The moral value of that is zero. Yeah, they could do a lot of things. For example, one thing they could do is what you said, turn them over to a third party. Oh, the problem with that is the U.S. has refused to allow it. Now, are they serious in that offer that's been going on for a couple of weeks? Well, we don't know. Because every time the offer is made, George Bush stands up and says, we're not going to talk to you. We're not going to negotiate with you. We don't want them turned over. It has nothing to do with how rotten the Taliban are. Yeah, they're rotten. A lot of rotten things in the world. We should be, if we're serious, we should be concerned with what we do and what we can do. If there's an elementary moral truism, that's it. People don't understand that. They're just not in the moral universe. What about your analogy? So let's say there's a killer in a house, and incidentally, nobody knows where he is. First of all, they don't even know that he's the person. Notice they don't have any evidence against him. I mean, there's evidence that his networks are in the background. Yeah, that's almost certainly true, although no evidence is presented. Like I said, it's prima facie plausible. But they don't know that it's him. He may be telling the truth when he says he wasn't involved, and there's some reason to believe it. In fact, a good deal of the foreign press and commentators believe it, because it just doesn't seem credible that he could have carried it out or initiated it. So they don't know that he's the perpetrator, and they don't know where he is. They haven't a clue where he is. So let's pick your house analogy, if you like. You say that there are people there who are going to defend him. Are those the 7 to 8 million Afghans who we're trying to starve to death? Are they defending him? No, there's victims. They're not defending him. The people we're killing are innocent Afghans, not people who are defending Osama bin Laden. They're the victims of the Taliban. They're the ones we're attacking. The analogy you made is an interesting case, and you could talk about it in some seminar. It's got nothing to do with this. What's going on here, when the New York Times tells us that food shipments have been cut back to the point where the number of people now at risk of starvation since September 11th has increased by 50% to 7.5 million. That's another 2.5 million people at risk of starvation since September 11th, as a result, as they point out correctly, of the threat of U.S. bombing and the terror it's caused and so on, and the withdrawal of aid and of international workers. Well, those people are not defending bin Laden. Those are perfectly innocent civilians who have nothing to do with it, except that they're victims of the Taliban, who we, meaning you and I, not some abstract entity, are consciously acting to murder. Okay? If we can't face that, we have no right talking about this problem. Okay, so tell me why it's a lot of crap. You only have... All right, let her talk. I'm not blaming the country at all. Because I'm not...
Thank you for sharing your opinion.
Wavelength.
I need to ask us all to
Let's go systematically. Let's go systematically through the
thank
questions.
you. Have a seat.
Okay, thank you for your comment. Let's go on. Yeah.
It's going to be tough to follow these two acts. I have two quick questions. One is, what do you think the role of oil plays in U.S. desires to dominate the region, and if any in the...
Can you allow somebody else to say something? Can you allow somebody else to say something? Try allowing someone else to talk. There's a lot of other people who have been waiting too. You're not the only one. Go ahead. Stand in line and you'll have your chance. Go ahead.
I'm wondering what you think U.S. interests in the region are in terms of oil in general and also specifically in the war. And also, I know you won't want to answer this question, but what do you think the chances of us living for one more year are?
Well, you know, actually, it's not an unreasonable question. I mean, one of the reasons why the Bush administration drew back from its initial plans to have a massive visible slaughter was the concern that throughout the region, this would have extremely disruptive effects. For example, it might lead to a revolution, to a Taliban-style revolution in Pakistan. Pakistan has nuclear weapons. Taliban-style revolution, which, you know, we don't know how far away that is. If you take a look at the Gallup poll in Pakistan, whatever it means in Pakistan, I'm not sure. The latest one showed about, I think, 3% of the population supporting the United States, and namely all the ones that were quoted in the newspapers, and like about 85% opposing the war against Afghan civilians. Well, you know, who knows where that's going to go? And suppose it spread to Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is it's a brutal, oppressive regime, sponsored by the United States since its origins, very strongly disliked by much of its population, or even hated. Because of the oppression in these countries, there has been an opening to radical Islamists as a way of reacting when they're blocked from political participation. That's well known. All right, suppose those forces happen to take control in Saudi Arabia. Now we're talking about major nuclear war. That's the source of the major energy reserves in the world. The United States will never let that happen. I mean, I don't think any of this is going to happen, but, it's not that remote. On your first question, and that's why the Bush administration backed off, certainly, and are now trying to follow a very delicate line. Anything in that region, oil is in the background. I mean, if there wasn't oil, if it wasn't the major energy reserve of the world, the West would pay as much attention to it as they do the Congo. We have a lot of responsibility for the atrocities in the Congo, major responsibilities. It goes back to the assassination of Lumumba 40 years ago, and a lot of stuff since. So when you just talk about those savages killing each other, remember, we, and I don't mean an abstract America, I mean nice folks like us, including me, we have a lot of responsibility for it, big responsibility. But nobody's trying to do anything about it, because there isn't that much at stake in terms of, profit and power and so on. Plenty of resources, but we'll get them later after they kill each other. In the case of the major energy reserves of the world, it's a different story. They happen to be in the Gulf region, primarily in Saudi Arabia, secondarily in Iraq, a lot of natural gas in other countries, and in Central Asia. It's not at the level of the Gulf, but it's substantial. And anything that's done, that's somewhere in the background. Now, there's a lot of speculation now that the reason the U.S. is fighting in Afghanistan is because of oil pipelines that they want to put through and that sort of thing. I think that's pretty implausible. I mean, it's in the background, undoubtedly, but it can't be the reason. I mean, if it were the reason, why didn't they do it a year ago or 2 years ago when Unocal also wanted to build a pipeline? I mean, it can't be the immediate reason. It's all over the internet. You see it everywhere, lots of speculation. And what is being said is not false. I mean, there are concerns about, the so-called new great game, it's sometimes called. The effort to try to of imperial powers to try to control this region the way the Russians and the British did, 100 years ago. And yeah, that's going on, and there's a lot of jockeying for power. Who's going to get control of getting the gas and oil out of the Central Asia region? The U.S. wants to make sure its corporations do it, not the Russians, not the Iranians, and a lot of interplays. So sure, that's in the background, but it's always in the background. The events that are happening now had a different cause. They have that in the background, but a different cause. Yeah.
To some extent, you already answered my question, but I'm wondering what you have to say about other economic interests that could be at stake. You've been very vocal about militarization of Israel, for example. You've been very vocal about the role that militarization has played and during the Cold War, the role that it played and how important it was to satisfy certain very specific interests. I'm sort of at a loss when you say that those interests couldn't be at stake here.
Couldn't be at stake?
Yeah.
Oh, they are at stake. They're in the background. But look, there's a difference between issues that are in the background and an immediate cause. Those issues are constantly in the background. But if something is happening now and not a year ago, when the background issues were the same, we look for a different cause. Look, if you're an MIT student, you've studied the sciences, you should know this. That's what you do. That's the way you do science. A lot of background things all the time. If something happens at a particular moment when the background conditions remain the same, you look for what changed at that moment.
I guess I just don't see how it wouldn't be immediate, how these causes wouldn't be operative in an immediate sense. How these causes would only be background causes and not operative at an immediate level. They are
operative the way background causes are always operative. They're waiting, they're part of the background which some circumstance triggers. Okay. Now, as far as militarization goes, you may have misunderstood me. I don't know exactly what you mean, but I mean, yes, militarization is extremely dangerous. It's hazardous to human life. But its economic role is primarily, I mean, everyone at MIT ought to know this. It pays our salaries. Its economic role is as a cover for development of the high-tech economy. And yes, that's a background issue all the time. If anybody at MIT doesn't know this, they haven't looked at their paycheck.
Thank you for your comments.
I'd just first like to say that it's obvious from the turnout in the overflow rooms, several overflow rooms apparently also, how much hunger there is for this kind of alternative, an opportunity to have this kind of alternative discussion of these issues. To support what you said earlier, one of the things you said earlier about public opinion, referencing articles in the Wall Street Journal, somebody from the State Department Bureau of Intelligence and Research earlier today talked about how the leak on October 1st about the U.S. policy regarding recognizing a Palestinian state, and then Bush's comments on October 2nd anticipating some statement sometime in the future on the so-called vision for a Palestinian state. Actually, one of the sources of that was polling that is being done, even though they're not democratic countries, that there is apparently extensive polling going on in Arab countries, I guess in particular, indicating the overwhelming public opinion turning against the United States in that region because of principally what's happening to the Palestinians.
Partly.
Well, okay, I'm referring to what, as
Look,
I remember her
maybe the
characterization.
State Department has to take polls to discover this, but anybody who knows a
Right.
thing about the region has known this
Right.
all the time.
Right. I'm just saying, even they. I mean, it's not just
Okay.
So there is some additional support for that.
Yeah.
My question has to do with what I think is still unanswered in the minds of many of us, even from what you've said about it, and that is when you talked about finding the perpetrators and bringing them to trial, or perhaps an acceptable substitution would be bringing them to justice. And I think there are really serious questions about how much evidence there ever, what is a reasonable standard of evidence in a situation like this? What would be an appropriate venue? How realistic it actually is? And I would like you specifically to please address, I would guess you've read the article that Richard Falk wrote in the October 29th issue of The Nation, where he argues for that this is a case of a just war. If there is a case for a just war since the Second World War, this would be it. And he argues for limited ends and limited means.
I don't know what that. I read the article. I thought it was totally vacuous.
Yeah.
I mean, if you want to find the, I mean, it's nice words. Look, he's a personal friend of mine, an old personal friend. I just didn't understand what he was saying. If there are, I mean, somebody carried it out. Okay. If you can't find out who did it, you can't punish anybody. That's just a fact. You can't find out who did it, you can't punish anyone. And you certainly do not reach justice by carrying out activities which are aimed at hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of people who had nothing to do with it. And they're the ones who are being attacked at this minute. Okay? That has nothing to do with just war. I mean, if you cannot, if evidence can be found, suppose you do find the perpetrators and you have a really solid case against them, well, then problems arise. For example, the problems that Nicaragua faced in a much more serious terrorist war, remember. What happened on September 11th is bad enough, but killing tens of thousands of people in a poor country and practically wiping it out, or doing what Time magazine and the New York Times were so happy about in their own words, that's worse. And they knew who the perpetrators were, no secret, and they had a judgment against them from the highest judicial body, namely the World Court. And they could have had a Security Council resolution if the perpetrator hadn't vetoed it. And yes, they couldn't do anything about it. It's not easy to bring perpetrators to justice. I mentioned another case, Haiti. They cannot bring Emmanuel Constant to justice. And remember, we're only talking about 4,000 or 5,000 black people, right? And that's it by comparative to the United States, that's hundreds of thousands of people killed. But they can't do anything about it. And they can't do anything about it not because of an abstract entity called America, but because people like us aren't doing anything about it. Don't put the blame anywhere else. Let's look in the mirror, If we want Emmanuel Constant brought to justice, we can do something about it. And we could have done it years ago. And yes, if we don't do it, they'll never be able to handle it. They're running up against a much bigger force. If the United States could have had any substantial evidence against Osama bin Laden, they would have him in their hands right now. I mean, I don't see any reason to doubt. I mean, the Taliban maybe, think anything you like about them. I mean, the worst criminal since, Attila the Hun or whatever you like. There's every reason to believe that they're quite sincere in not wanting to be bombed to smithereens, and if they could prevent that by handing over bin Laden, they'd probably do it, just like they've offered. But their request that there be some evidence is not an unreasonable request.
You don't think that's a ruse?
I don't know if it's a ruse. There's one way to find out. There's exactly one way to find out, and that is to try it. Now, obviously, the United States doesn't think it's a ruse. If otherwise, they would try it. And when they see, well, they're not handing them over, okay, then you proceed. But they don't want to take that chance. Not only do they not want to take the chance, but the government has a deeper principle, the one that I mentioned. We do not need a powerful state does not want authorization, because that weakens its power. If you have to have authorization from someone, you are not, powerful enough to do anything you choose. The same reason why the mafia don does not want a court order. Suppose some mafia don isn't being paid by some guy, a grocer or something. He doesn't go after a court order to get the money. He doesn't want a court order. He wants to send his goons in to beat him to a pulp, That's called credibility. And it happens that that's the way states operate. Some of them can get away with it, the more powerful ones. Most of them can't get away with it. Maybe they'd like to, but Luxembourg can't handle it, or Andorra. But countries like the United States can, unless we stop them. And the only place that a powerful state can be stopped is within. Yes, there are problems in bringing them to justice, but I don't think the U.S. wants to, for the reasons that I mentioned. For one thing, they probably don't have evidence. For another thing, if he is brought to trial, it's going to open up all sorts of questions that they certainly do not want opened, like the kind that I mentioned. So yeah, there are problems, and other countries have faced them very hard problems, like they can't do it if it's the U.S. who's carrying out the terror or who's safeguarding the terrorists. No, there's nothing they can do. We can do it, but Haiti and Nicaragua can't. But the United States is not going to have those impediments. Incidentally, on the Palestinian state business, I think we should be a little cautious here. I mean, calling something a state is absolutely nothing. I mean, South Africa, for example, in the worst days, wanted the world to recognize the states that it had set up, like Chomsky. I mean, they were states, had their own presidents and armies and everything else, and the Bantustans, the homelands. And South Africa was trying to get the world to recognize them. No one would do it properly. If you really want to know the truth, the first government in Israel that was willing to officially consider a Palestinian state was the Netanyahu government, the most reactionary of all. Its Minister of Information, Dore Gold, who I think is an American, judging by his accent, he had an interview with someone, and he said, look, if they want a state, we'll allow them to call it a state. And then he said they can call it chopped chicken if they like. Call it whatever they want. You want to call it a state, okay. As long as we control it and it's a Bantustan, they can call it a state. The Bush proposals were not taken seriously by anyone, even the articles that reported them. You didn't have to wait for leaks. If you read, the way to read the newspapers, say the New York Times, always is begin from the end of the column. Begin from the end of the column on the continuation page. There you may learn something. The first couple of paragraphs, you get what's given to the editorial writers and the propagandists and so on. Then, if it's an honest journalist, toward the end of the column, they'll say something, usually on the continuation page. And that was true in this case. A lot of hullabaloo about, Powell and Bush are talking about a Palestinian state. You go into the continuation page, they start quoting high officials and this and that, and they say, well, look, we're not going to go as far as Clinton did, certainly. And where Clinton went is nowhere. Here it was called magnanimous and wonderful, but as soon as you look at a map, you knew that isn't true. I suppose that's one of the reasons that maps were never published. Try to find one of the proposals. And in the region, everybody knows, including the Israeli press. But they said they're not even going to go that far. Well, maybe they'll change. Who knows? They don't have to take polls to find that out. But the change is not so simple. I mean, every year it gets harder. It was hard 10 years ago. It's much harder. 5 years ago, it was harder. Still harder. A year ago, it's still harder now. And the reason is that the settlement and integration of the occupied territories and the takeover of their resources continues. Who's paying for it? You and me. In one or another way, we're indirectly paying for it. There's, the U.S., every time Israel assassinates someone, there's a mild tap on the wrist. Dozens of assassinations so far. How are they doing it? I mean, when they assassinate somebody by helicopters, as they do regularly, where are they getting the helicopters? They don't produce helicopters. That's one of their advanced military system, but they don't produce helicopters. We give them the helicopters, knowing what they're going to do with it. I mean, as soon as the U.S. helicopters began to attack civilian compounds last October 1st and 2nd, there was no fire. It was just attacking civilian targets, killing dozens of people. Instantly, Clinton arranged for the biggest shipment of helicopters in a decade to Israel, October 3rd. Couldn't get any press in the United States to report it. I mean, not that there weren't efforts. There were. I was involved in them and others. They wouldn't report it, but it happened. Read it in the Israeli press if you want, or the international military press. Yeah, it happened. The Bush administration sent new attack helicopters, more advanced ones, the ones that are being used to murder people, like the ones who killed Abu Ali Mustafa, the most important political leader killed, assassinated. And that was everybody knew at that time there's going to be revenge, and yesterday there was. They killed an Israeli right-wing parliamentarian in revenge. But who sent the helicopter to kill the political leader in the first place? Well, we did. So yeah, as long as that goes on, the cycle of violence will go on. The U.S. knows exactly how to maybe not stop it, but certainly mitigate it and lessen it in all sorts of ways, but they're not under internal pressure to do it, and for their own reasons they don't want to.
Okay.
The vacuousness of that definition, how terrorism can be defined depending on which side you are on, as either freedom fighting, as Reagan did, or as destroying a country, as the Nicaraguans did in that instance, or etc. And one thing I found implied in everything you were saying is the notion of peace as possibly also being another vacuous concept that we cling to and define subjectively for our own purposes. As a human being of conscience, or trying to become more of a human being of conscience with the intellectual understanding of what's going on now, how can you, there were a lot of peace demonstrations in Washington, D.C. recently, and as a person of conscience who's starting to understand these issues, it was difficult to separate the vacuousness of the notion of peace that's used on both sides in order to achieve goals that are unrelated to what just happened, and the notions of terrorism. As a man of conscience, with your understanding, what would you do if you were president?
Okay.
If you were Bush right now?
Well, if I was Bush, I'd resign before I get tried by a criminal court. But if I gave that impression, I wasn't being clear. I don't think these are vacuous concepts, and I don't think they're just subjective. I think they're very clear, reasonably clear concepts. Not clear like quantum physics, but reasonably clear.
I'm a lawyer. That's not clear to me.
Okay. International law is reasonably clear. For example, when the World Court reached its decision condemning the United States for international terrorism, it had good grounds and a solid argument, runs through hundreds of pages if you read it. The U.S. knew that it was a solid argument. That's why the U.S. refused to accept the jurisdiction of the court. And yes, that was pretty clear. It wasn't vacuous. Same with terrorism. If I didn't make it clear, let me say it now. I think the definition given in the U.S. Code and U.S. Army manuals is the right definition. I've always accepted it. The definition that I quoted, I think, is exactly the right definition. Okay, it doesn't answer every imaginable question. You know, you can have a philosophy seminar where you can make up cases where it doesn't deal with. But in the real world, it covers almost everything. There's nothing subjective about it. The point is that it cannot be accepted because of its consequences. Its consequences tell us that we're doing terrible things, and therefore we don't accept it. I mean, the Nazis weren't carrying out counter-terror. They were carrying out terror. I mean, they called it counter-terror, and the U.S. military agreed with them, but for their own reasons. We don't have to accept that. It's not a vacuous, subjective concept. That's true of, you know, if you're a lawyer, so you know better than I do. I mean, the legal system does not apply trivially to every situation that comes up. That's why judges have to think. You know. But nevertheless, it's a framework. You know. Sometimes you think it's a wrong framework, so you change the laws. But it's a framework. And the same is true of international law. And the same is true of terrorism, and the same is true of peace.
Perhaps I overstated the moral relativism of your position, but what I was trying to get at was the fact that the World Court, other UN organizations or institutions that the United States played a major role in creating, and hence have a major role in shaping how they define the language, the discourse of justice. If that's the case, and you see these institutions can't hold up in the face of something that affects the United States or change their stances in the face of what affects the United States, then what would you do in that situation if you were President of the United States, understanding you have a political imperative to seek retribution?
Well, see, if I can restate your question, let's put it this, see if I get it wrong. Suppose you're the president of the leading terrorist state in the world, and the World Court condemns you for terrorism and orders you to stop, and the Security Council tries to pass a resolution calling on you to observe international law and you veto it, then what do you do as President of the United States? Well, you don't try to change the World Court. You don't try to change the UN. You stop your terrorism. Okay?
So is that what we should, as students, is that what you would ask us to rally for now? Is that your invocation to all of us here to rally for them to stop the specific acts that you mentioned today?
You figure out what you think is there. I'm not telling you. Look, I think it's the wrong thing to do the plans that they are now announcing is their plans. Their assumptions are that what they're doing may very well kill a couple of million innocent people in Afghanistan. Okay, I happen to think that's wrong. If somebody else thinks it's right, okay. I think it's wrong, terribly wrong, in fact, monstrous, and I think we ought to do something about it.
Thank you.
The 2,000 people listening here at MIT and the many others listening on the World Wide Web, I'd like to thank Professor Chomsky for being with us today.
And you've been watching Noam Chomsky speaking on the new war against terror. Recorded on October 18, 2001 at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, Cambridge, Massachusetts. This presentation is also available on audio tape. For a copy of this tape, either audio or video, please contact Roger Leisner, Leisner, in care of Radio Free Maine, Post Office Box 2705, Augusta, Maine 04338. Or go to the Radio Free Maine website, radiofreemaine.com. So Martin Boker of No U-Turn Radio, was that a good talk tonight? Was that a good talk tonight? All right.